and welcome to season 2 of The Future Of. We've been away. Hi, Vasie, how are you?
Hi, how are you, Azam? How's everything going?
Things are good. Very excited for season 2. We have some fun stuff in store. But first of all, we really want to thank everyone for all the support. Season 1, we received overwhelming support. I don't think we expected the kind of response that we did. And towards the end, our podcast continued to go stronger and stronger. And even Um, our last episode was published sometime during the summer, and since then we're still getting um, regular downloads. Which we want to thank everyone who's been listening in and who rated us on all those different platforms. So really appreciate it. We're very excited for season 2. You have some really interesting guests coming lined up for you. We have a lot of very interesting topics. Vasi, why don't you share some of the stuff that's coming up?
Yeah, and I also, thank you everybody for listening. I think the other thing too is a lot has changed. Some of our episodes when we started or actually completed the end of season 1 was just at the start of the pandemic. We're about 9 months into the pandemic now, and I think for us, Azam and I really want season 2 to be focused on the future of state of things that really, when we think of everything that we've gone through individually and as a society, what are some of those impacts? And so we are excited to make sure our episodes are very topical. And we also want to bring back some of our guests from season 1, especially the ones around the future of the economy, as well as the future of coronavirus. Because I think even since the last time we spoke to both of them, quite a lot has changed in that context. And to Azam's point, we've got some interesting guests we've lined up for season 2. A couple of them are going to be in the first few episodes. One is the future of leadership, which I think, again, if we do an interesting sort of summary of what's gone on from a leadership perspective, both politically and economically and in a lot of different spheres, I think there's a lot that we can learn to surmise and see what that looks like future state. And then our second episode is really going to focus on the future of communications and namely really public relations. Because Azam, I think, as you know, one of the things that's emerged from this pandemic has also been how we communicate, how we come off, what people are saying. And I think there's been a big shift in that communication on all kinds of different platforms, no?
No, absolutely, and we've seen how important leadership is and how critical the messaging can be. So our first episode today is on leadership, but I think both these topics sort of go hand in hand, which is why we decided we'll take a stab at this. And it's critical. Leadership doesn't just, it means that you have a head of a government or someone leading a group. It's even when subject matter experts, especially during pandemic, we saw where they came out and when you hear guidelines, you have to reassure the public. And how do you lead the people that way, right? So there's a lot more to leadership that way. And we had an interesting conversation with Erik Kieser, who's our guest for today.
Yes,
He's a
yeah.
leadership coach based in California. Vasi, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners a little bit more?
Absolutely. So yeah, we were able to speak to Erik Kieser. He is, like Azam said, a leadership coach, especially within sort of the executive field. So he does, a lot of leaders within the Fortune 500 space. He is based in California, so a lot of the tech sector as well. And what makes him really unique and interesting is that his background, or I would say his focus or specialty, is really on conflict and conflict resolution. And I think when you really think of the context of leadership, a lot of leadership is really dealing with conflict. And we thought it was very timely to speak to somebody like that, because conflict now more than ever is really at the daily center of everything that goes on, right? Whether it's in our personal lives, probably our professional lives, and even at a higher sort of abstract level, government and whatnot. There is this tension, living through a pandemic that nobody's ever really experienced before. And how do we lead through times like this? And I found, a lot of what we talked about with him quite fascinating. And
so Erik, thank you so much for joining us today. You are actually going to be our first guest of season 2 of the Future of Podcast.
Thank you.
Season 1 ended quite well, and Azam and I want to welcome you and say thank you very much for agreeing to be a guest on our podcast today. As you see, our format is going to be a little different. You're going to hear us through all of the podcast platforms through voice, but we're also now going to be doing all of our podcasting episodes through Zoom, so you can see us visually and see how we're engaging and so forth. And this is sort of a new platform for us. We are in the midst of a pandemic. We all need to socially distance, and this is frankly the new normal in terms of how we'll be chatting with people. So Erik, we have you on the show today. We know you are an expert in the field of leadership coaching, leadership, especially in the areas of really conflict, trust, and really helping to build up people in terms of their leadership capabilities long term. One of the things that we have seen, especially during this pandemic, is that this notion of leadership has really fundamentally shifted. And so one of the things I was hoping we could discuss with you to start off with is maybe explain, what your definition of leadership would have been in the past or maybe recently, and now based on this really huge change that we've seen in society because of what's happened, what the notion of leadership really looks like moving forward.
Well, you've asked an incredibly huge question, so I hope I have several hours to answer you. Leadership is one of those topics that we talk about as if we knew, but in fact, it's so broad and so encompassing and touches so many disciplines that it's almost impossible really to quantify the way we'd like to quantify it. You can do an entire master's or doctorate, for instance, in leadership and never exhaust the topic. So, but to answer your question, if there was an old school way of defining leadership, you would use words like strong and decisive and firm and perhaps detached and analytic. There would be very little language around relationship or team except as minions to serve the leader. And while that sounds a little odd to a modern audience, that's very much been the model of leadership in business for a long time. That's, as you said, going through a lot of change, and not just with the pandemic. It's actually been under assault, I'd argue, for the last 30 years. Thinkers like Tom Peters or Peter Drucker have all called into question, what the heck are we doing when we talk about leadership like that? As you said, Vasie, in a different conversation from here, the audience is changing, the employee audience is changing, the customer of the business is changing. We don't just want people bossing people around, and we don't see leadership as a unilateral or unidirectional activity. Teams now want to participate in the conversation. Why are we doing this? Why are we not involved in the strategic direction? Unheard of a quarter century ago to have employees pushing back, unless it was Ben and Jerry's. You didn't have those conversations. Now it seems to be routine. There's a whole generation, and it's become almost cliche that the millennials expect to be included, at least in the conversation, and even have some say in what the company is doing, how it's acting ethically and morally, questions that were off the table a quarter century ago. So if I had to say there's a new definition of leadership without taking too long, I would say leadership has become much more collaborative, even if the current leaders aren't aware of it, even if they don't like it. Business, industry, science is being forced to a more collaborative, and you could almost say a more human model of leadership.
And so are there any, what you would say, examples of sort of, and I guess we'll focus on business leadership, because that's probably, to your point, leadership is such a broad topic, but business leadership is maybe one that we could really hone in on. Any good examples today of how you define that attribution of team player, collaboration, really listening to your employee base, of examples today of CEOs that you would say that do that well currently?
Well, and when you sent that question, I was really forced to sit and think about it. I can't readily summon a business leader, and they exist, such creatures are running around out there. It's difficult in some respects to summon that kind of leader. I'm going to cheat and move away from business for a moment. I would say, in some respects, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, has demonstrated a rather remarkable capacity for that kind of leadership in the last few months here in the States. and I don't mean it's a perfect model by any means. There's still some of the autocrat and the director in Governor Cuomo, but nevertheless, he has adopted a much more communicative, much more collaborative style. He's, working hard to keep people in the loop. To go back to the earlier question of a definition of leadership, people expect to be in the communication flow. One of the things modern leadership has to take into account, it really does have to talk to, and to some extent be accountable for the conversation with teams. I can't point to a business example I like very much. There's a company named Autodesk, based out of San Francisco, a CAD company of some reputation. Their current CEO, Mr. Sullivan, is a great example of someone who seems to understand this collaborative, communicative model. He does essentially a weekly fireside chat, and the entire company, which is all over the world, is involved in those conversations. He takes questions, he's publishing a newsletter, he's talking a lot with his employees, and he's taking feedback for that behavior. He's also working to make Autodesk a more accountable company, socially, ethically, morally. So I would have to think some more on the question, but I'm troubled that I'm having a hard time summoning more than a couple of examples.
Right. So that's interesting you say that. So is that an indication that maybe we're not there yet as a society in terms of the reckoning of what that sort of business leadership looks like? And maybe that's really the direction we really need to head. Because when I thought of the question too, I personally couldn't really think of anybody as well. I don't know about you, Azam, if somebody pops into your mind that you think is sort of the model of what that modern leadership model looks like moving forward, or.
No, and that's interesting you mentioned that, because I mean, like Erik mentioned, there might be a few examples here and there, but by and large, you still don't see, that new age leader who has that capacity of taking on. I just want to follow up something you mentioned about open communication, right? Can you expand a little bit more on that? And both in terms of, I know CEO, especially publicly listed companies, they've always had this relationship with shareholders. There's more communication, right? I think employees have become a much bigger voice over the last little while, and communicating with employees has also become very important. So can you expand a little bit more about communication, and what do you mean by that?
Well, historically, leaders weren't accountable really to anyone. Maybe shareholders, not always then, sometimes boards, or occasionally their command teams. But again, the older model, and we're speaking in generalities here, so I want to paint everybody with the same brush, but in general, leaders were expected to be the leader. It was very much a military model, or even we could say a patriarchal model. There's someone at the top who makes the decision, and we jump to when they make that decision. They may or may not solicit input. They may or may not invite debate. It was really almost an addition or a luxury that a team would be included in that conversation, except at the very, very highest levels. That's been shifting for more than a generation based on a number of factors. But more than anything else, I'm not sure what the language is, there's a parity that's coming into the culture. We're no longer crazy, if we ever were, of this top-down model. We expect to be involved. And there's a lot of theories around why that's the case. Expanded communication technologically, we're all in touch now. There's a democratic model, you might call it, in the West, where, and I mean the United States, Western Europe, Eastern Asia, that says, hey, my voice counts. Whatever the reason, we're expecting to be involved in the discussion. So one piece is this notion that employees can hold their leaders accountable for how the company behaves ethically. That's just crazy talk 3 or 4 decades ago. But now employees expect to hear, where are we giving our money? Are we taking care of the environment? Are we aware of child labor laws? There's just so many things employees expect to be kept up to speed on. One interesting development is the whistleblower, and how much we're seeing people come forward and talk about ethical lapses. In the 1950s, whistleblowers would have been taken out quietly and beaten to death because it was so outside the model. And now we actually have shield laws that help whistleblowers. So, and at the heart of that is communication. At the heart of all of that is, I expect to be in the loop to some extent. Go ahead, please.
So that's interesting. So obviously when you talk about 50s, 60s, Milton Friedman used to say that the sole purpose of a corporation is maximizing profit and nothing beyond that. And we've definitely come a long way from their corporate social responsibility is one. But more and more employees and even shareholders are demanding more of leadership, right?
Yes.
So one of the things that I came across, and I work for a financial institution, and you see this kind of conversation starting to jump through, is especially on the political side and a lot of social issues like employees, shareholders, they're demanding a lot of conversation, right? So a lot of times when you'd say, a couple of topics you always stay away from, and politics was one of them, but especially with the Black Lives Matter, I mean, it's become a forefront issue, and it's something that's forcing CEOs to address it proactively.
Mhm.
How do you see this whole social political movements impacting the nature of leadership, and what truly should we expect from leaders on that end?
Mm-hmm.
You're asking huge questions. You guys have a gift for asking really massive questions. So
Yeah.
congratulations.
Azam also,
We had lots
Azam
of time
also,
during the pandemic. There's not much you can do. So let's think of
did.
these
And
questions.
Azam also read my mind, because that was actually a question I was going to ask as well, in terms of, these social political movements have completely disrupted society, but the parallel disruption now has been that they've disrupted the way in which the employee workforce demands of companies and organizations now as well.
Absolutely. And you can trace its origins back to different places. The 60s are really a relevant conversation. In the 1950s, someone like Milton Friedman could make a statement without blushing that the only existence of the corporation was to make profit, maximize profit. That's almost an absurd statement here in 2020. But then you look at the 60s, and suddenly, college students are demanding an audience, and there's the women's movement and gay and lesbian rights, and you have all kinds of things happening that were unthinkable 10 years earlier. So I think we really have to talk about a cultural context to what's happening to business. And I would gently contend business has been one of the conservative forces that has resisted that cultural sweep. But it's become too broad now. It's so large now that business must adopt. It's being forced to adopt. And to a point you made earlier, Vasie, it's hard to find lots of examples. And I'll be curious to hear what folks come back to as they listen to this. They'll come up with their own examples. But that we don't have 10 or 15 at hand to point to is very revealing, because I believe, at the risk of sounding politically correct, business leadership is still largely white, still almost entirely male, and is still in some respects back in the past. We have a generation of leaders. We see it politically, we certainly see it in business, we even see it in science. We're almost waiting for a generation to move on, and the new generation to finish this transition. But hoping to answer your question, business has resisted this change, and so leaders are being almost forced against their will to address Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, lots of things. Climate change still rages through the halls of business because it hits the bottom line, right? We're going to have to really change processes and adopt strategies to minimize climate impact. And we have seen companies go kicking and screaming almost against their will to having to be accountable for things like economic or ecological impact. So it's a slow process, and we're not going willingly, I would argue.
And so just to push on that a bit more, what would you then say, moving forward, sort of future state leadership, knowing that the employee workforce demands better, they demand action on these issues, what would a better leadership model look for some of these business leaders to really navigate or kind of stick handle a lot of these topics, because it is very political and it's very difficult, right, to make that connection between what's happening socially and politically and what can be done within a systemic sort of structure organizationally.
Well, so I want to reference my earlier notion that business is conservative, and business should be conservative to some extent, right? We want business to remain stable and remain profitable. The mission may not be entirely about maximizing profit, but you do have to make a profit, et cetera. So what are models that can keep that focus or keep that at least central while adopting this new framework? The funny part is it's pretty inexpensive. I think it's more a shift of mindset and attitude than it is anything you have to do in some big dramatic way. One very simple thing is to engage in the dialogue. As a leader, begin to actively solicit feedback from your employees and be aggressive about it. So much of the past about communication has been painting a picture. We want the company to be seen as X, and Vasie, I don't got to tell you that. It's an entire industry, right? Is to paint the image of the company,
Yeah.
right? But now that's being challenged, and now people want to see past the mask. They want to know what these people really are about. So one issue is, are you listening? Are you listening to clients? Are you listening to your vendors? Are you listening to your employees? Are you listening to the public at large? Because there's a lot of opportunity to gather data, especially in this age. So listening as a specific communication skill is big. Two, not just listening, but obviously thinking about and integrating that information into your approach. One of the things that I don't think old school leaders necessarily understand is, you don't always have to agree with me. I just want to have a sense that I'm a voice at the table. We're looking for a dialogue, piece number 2. Let's have a discussion. And it can be a discussion that's based on a weekly fireside chat or a newsletter or something else. I've heard this information. This is what I'm thinking. Let the debate begin. Let's have a dialogue about it. I think number 3, address the most egregious sins. I think a lot of us can still kind of quickly clean up some old school behavior and thinking. I see this a lot. I'm going to walk into dangerous territory now. Silicon Valley is one terrible example of how even after all the storm and drama about, women not being represented fairly or equally within tech, it's still abysmal. Tech companies are still just getting started. One company I know in the Valley has lost 4 significant female leaders in the last 2 months because it's the 1990s as far as equality with women and men. So point number 3, address the most egregious problems first. You can get a lot of credit just by addressing the things that are clearly a problem. I think one last thing to consider is you have to be a little more vulnerable as a leader. That we have to see more of you. Again, we don't want an image. We want to know who you are. In this age of increasing egalitarianism, talk to us. Treat us like you're a person and we're peers in a conversation.
Yeah. And I think also to add, one of the things, both Azam and I work for large, companies, multinationals, is also the expectation for leadership moving forward too is rather than that corporate BS communication, like really, I know I shouldn't say that, but it's, it's true, is really this notion of walking the talk, right? So like dialogue is good. It's great to have, but it just can't be lip service anymore. Like and I think that's where, for me, it's shifted quite a lot. Like it used to be raw, this is what we're doing on diversity and this is what we're doing here, but it isn't, you can't do that anymore. And that's sort of where I feel that's a big shift. So do you have any thoughts sort of around that, the whole walk the talk kind of?
I would call that under the category for me of addressing the egregious sins. We're not interested now in a picture. We don't want an image. We want to have a sense of what this company and you as a leader are really about. And we're fairly harsh critics these days. We don't just buy into the picture or the PR map. We want to have a sense of authenticity. And so, yes, we can't just talk. We have to demonstrate action. And I think I'm giving these in terms of baby steps. If you're an old school CEO, if you're having a hard time with this, look at the most glaring problems, tackle those. It's going to give you an awful lot of street cred. And it's not expensive. The funny part is none of this has to cost a lot of money or affect the bottom line very much, but it may be painful. Speaking as a white guy, in case you can't tell, I'm a white guy. I understand that we have come out of an age where it was, for us, relatively easy. It's remarkable that we are still wrestling with notions of race equality or gender equality. But hey, folks, let's update our calendars. It's 2020. Let's get up to speed. Even that much could go a long ways, I would argue, for a lot of companies.
So I just want to follow up one thing when you gave an example of the Silicon Valley. So I find Silicon Valley very interesting and intriguing in this sense is generally when you talk about the culture, you hear a lot of buzzwords like collaboration, and you talk a little bit about, now like how people come together and agile and all that. And you see the workspaces are designed in a way and people really like it, and you're seeing a lot of industries adopting it. So on that end, to keep workers happy, you can argue, okay, there is a different culture than it was in other industries. But as you move up, like you said,
there's still a glass ceiling there for a lot of demographics, right? And it's sort of like a contradiction that on one end you do have, for let's say majority of the white collar work, you do have all the facilities available, but you still have a glass ceiling. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm always nervous about doing something categoric and saying it's this thing, but a principal factor in this conversation is, I'm going to go back to patriarchy again. It's been a white man's world for a long time. And I mean, even the reaction this last year to the Black Lives Matter movement, or even really Me Too, is that it's hard for us to have these conversations. And this speaks to another point of leadership. We have to have the difficult conversations. So when I talk blithely about correcting the egregious sins, like inequalities of various kinds or climate change problems, we're going to bang into some hard conversations. We're going to have a hard time talking as a 65 or 70-year-old leader, potentially, or even younger, when I have a very genteel and unconscious racism, as an example, in the fabric of my being. One of the things Black Lives Matter has called out is you don't have to be an active, foaming at the mouth racist to practice racism. You don't have to be a raging misogynist to practice sexism. It can be just part of your automatic reactions. So I'm going to argue part of what we're talking about here is it's time to have the hard conversation, not just listen, but dialogue about that glass ceiling, for instance. I'm going to argue Silicon Valley has a pretty fierce glass ceiling for women. It's pretty terrible how you can bang up against that wall.
And Erik, is that because, to your point, I mean, we lack the diversity of sort of thought and voices at the top? And a part of it is that maybe they just, people don't think about it. It's sort of, I live in my world is pretty easy, or not easy, I shouldn't say that, but my world is what it is. So I assume my world is like everybody else's.
Well, and especially, you know, it's the favorite punching bag. I don't want to, this isn't all about this, but a good example of what you just said is, I'm a white guy, or even I'm a guy, but I'm a white guy. And so I'm expecting other guys to be assertive or even aggressive and pushy. We can use pretty rough language around each other. We can bang on each other. We're competing. This is all part of the unconscious landscape about being a white guy. So a woman shows up and we have this map about women, what women are supposed to do. So the pushy guy becomes, part of my language, the bitchy woman. This is as old as the hills now, right, in this conversation. But that's still something dawning on the consciousness of a lot of senior leaders, and not just in tech. And you look at the, you know, the exit interviews, and you look at the exposés and the books and the blog posts from women leaving tech, and it's the same patterns over and over again. You know, they weren't allowed to speak their minds. They weren't included in conversations. It's because we're not even aware in some respects that we're treating them differently, and it's uncomfortable. We don't want to talk about it. And so again, I'm back to, if you want to be a modern leader, you want to be an effective leader in this modern age, rather, it's time to start looking at the things you're avoiding. What are you not talking about? And what things make you uncomfortable? And then engage in that conversation. Talk about fixing egregious problems. That's an easy one.
I like that. I also know that a lot of the work that you do is in the space of really dealing with conflict. And I also know you on a personal level, you are a person that grew up being completely conflict adverse. Yes. And you've really sort of worked on being able to do that. And so I thought maybe we could have a bit of a discussion around that. And what are some of the things leaders need to do moving forward to deal with conflict properly and to be successful when it comes to conflict?
Thank you for all that open door and the chance to shamelessly self-promote, Vasie.
Okay, no problem. It's an important topic, though. So okay, I'm glad we could do that for you as well.
Thank you. I would have answered that question very differently even 5 years ago. I did graduate work in conflict resolution. There's a lot of writing done these days about conflict resolution, endless numbers of models and approaches and techniques. Books like The Difficult Conversation or Crucial Conversations are all designed to help us get towards this. I'm going to argue here in 2020 that the first thing a leader needs to think about when they're beginning to wade into difficult conversations is, strangely enough, what makes them anxious. Conflict, I have now concluded here in my advanced age of 60, really more than anything else comes down to what scares me. If a topic doesn't frighten me, I can talk about it. If a topic frightens me, probably I'm either avoiding it or I'm going to be forced into a conflict about it. I do a fair amount of couples coaching for coaching skills to help couples learn to fight with each other. We talk, it's just a common knowledge item that couples usually fight over money or sex. But what we really want to say about that is they don't feel comfortable talking about money or sex. Money or sex or both scare them, they make them anxious. So they avoid those topics until a problem inevitably rises, then they fight about it, usually poorly, they don't have the skills, they make it worse, they avoid the topic even more, and it creates a cycle where eventually there's an explosion, we're threatening divorce. That's with couples. That's happening in business too. One of my favorite leaders, a man who was part of the C-suite at both Mervyn's and Sears for a number of years, has called anxiety the elephant in the room. And let's go back to talking about largely white male leadership teams. If you're a guy, you don't talk about being afraid. That's off the table for a guy. Mm-hmm. Women are often much more comfortable saying, this thing scares me, this thing makes me uncomfortable. Unless they're competing with men, then they have to squish all that. And Vasie, you have no experience with that either, I'm sure.
I have lots of that experience.
So one of the great advantages to dragging women into the leadership team, if nothing else, is to develop an entirely different zeitgeist about a conversation we can have. And so again, for the cheap seats, conflict more than anything else comes down to what scares you. And so you first have to go, okay, so what makes this topic uncomfortable? Where am I threatened? What do I think is putting me in danger? And one of the key components of that is then sitting with that long enough to begin to change that from what I call crisis thinking to problem thinking. Things that scare us, we tend to treat as a crisis. And we're usually doing it semi or unconsciously. An effective leader, maybe one of the most important things he or she could do these days, is to sit with the things that make them uncomfortable and go, okay, so how is this a problem? How can I tackle this issue that I don't want to think about, I don't want to talk about as a problem? Element number 2 with conflict, start a dialogue about it. One of my favorite books, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Lencioni, one of the principal arguments Lencioni makes is that teams have to fight. But I'm here to tell you 90% or more of business on this planet is not fighting in the C-suite. They're doing anything but overt, deliberate conflict. Good to Great, Jim Collins, one of the premier books in the last 50 years about business, he argued before Lencioni, teams have to fight. The problem with both of those books is they don't really talk very much about how, which is why I drag in anxiety and then element number 2, start the conversation. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if you're not very skillful, make your intention clear. We're going to try to tackle this scary thing together as a team. I have a lot more to say, but I want to take a break and hear responses.
No, you please continue. It's quite fast.
Well,
this is very good too. Because I don't know about you, Azam. For me, I feel in business or just in life in general, the majority of us avoid conflict at all costs.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Like we're just so uncomfortable with even addressing things with one another, even on a personal level.
Absolutely.
That I'm with you. I think if there's a way to apply it to a leadership perspective in business, I can imagine that the potential for that greatness is there. So.
Well, and there's so many things pop out of this in my experience. And please smash me down if I go on too long about this, but this is a hot topic for me, is that as you begin to make yourself available for the difficult conversation, for the potential conflict, it's the only way you're going to develop any skill at doing it. And so the first 2, 3, 4, 5 conflicts are going to be messy, and you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to overreact, and there might be shouting or tears. That's okay. That's part of this evolutionary process. Every skill starts raw and becomes refined over time. There's another benefit for this, and this is especially to tie this back into boys, men. You have to be able to drop your shields a little bit and say, this thing frightens me, this thing scares me. Boys are not allowed to do that, at least old school boys. We're seeing that change in the millennials, although I don't think it's as profound a change as some writers would talk about, but it is changing. But there's a vulnerability that leadership these days is expected, frankly, by the public to demonstrate. I remember way back, this is going to really date me, but Edmund Muskie, when he was running for office, cried on camera. And the political experts at the time said that's what cost him that presidency. was that he dropped his shields. That's back in the 70s. Now, people that are vulnerable, we find attractive. We find them to be authentic. We feel like we have a sense of who they are. And there's another benefit for this, maybe the most important one to business. Forget everything I just said. If I can't sit with something that makes me anxious, if I can't sit with a scary topic, I cannot think as effectively as if I do. The minute I start moving it away from crisis to problem, my cortex engages much more effectively. And wait, there's more. Then if I drag it to my team and we turn it into a problem, now I have a group mind in a way that I didn't have before about this topic. Having trashed Silicon Valley a few minutes ago, I'll say more than anything else, those fine gentlemen are simply not sitting with the problem and really sitting with it. They're afraid of it, and they don't know how to sit with it or think about it clearly.
So let me push back a little bit. So it's interesting you've mentioned, and I agree that, you know, as men need to drop our shields a little bit. And we're seeing that kind of some level, like a change at some level. But is that truly always important? Because, and the reason I ask is, we're starting to see a rise of populism in the world, and you're seeing that these seemingly tough, you know, no nonsense people who're those populists, right? And it's not just the US, we see that in Brazil and to an extent in India, a lot of places. And part of their identity is that they're those old school, strong, tough men who,
yes.
So there's still appetite for that kind of leadership.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's
or
another reason why people are, like, you know, it's a little harder to make that change?
Or at least to add to that, there's some sort of obvious appeal if people are either voting for them or supporting them.
So again, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add with those examples that Azam gives, there's still a base of support that a lot of these leaders have, that you go, you know, what is the allure of this sort of type of leadership model that appeals to a larger percentage of people than maybe we want to accept? Right,
absolutely. Well, so again, you guys are just gifted at asking gigantic questions, and I tip my hat to you. I'm grateful as heck that you said there's a rise of populism. I would only push back on that and say we're well into the middle of a wave of populism. We have been here now, I'd argue, for the last decade. And
even Eastern Europe, if you see a lot of places.
Absolutely. And I would point us back gently to the 30s and 40s and the rise of fascism, which I would call a kind of populism. They're not the exact same thing, but we were looking for strong leaders back then, and we moved past that. We're there again, and I'm going to argue in both contexts it comes down to fear. People look to populists because they want to be reassured. It's interesting to look in this country, here in the States, and look at the lead currently Joe Biden has over Donald Trump. Whatever your politics, Joe Biden has a commanding, if not undefeatable, lead. Clearly not all of us are in the grip of populism. Some of us want to go back to a more effectively run and managed country, speaking as gently as I can about the last 4 years. But the people that don't, the people that are flying Trump banners at the moment, and I don't think it's a secret to any audience to call Trump a populist. He is a populist. I think other governors here in the United States are populists and have fed on that. What's the payoff for a populist? That person makes me feel safe. They speak my language. They understand my issues, or at least I think they do. They talk like they do. And they're talking about these decisive steps, a very old school model of leadership to deal with them. So it comes back again to fear. And in fact, in some respects, refusing the difficult conversation. As an example, the Southern Baptist Convention, I'm sure both of you are familiar with that particular organization, has been a very white church with a lot of black congregations for a very long time. In the last 2 years, just before Black Lives Matter, the convention was forced to adopt a new platform on civil rights and acknowledge the convention's failure. That's an unbelievable change for a very old school and very patriarchal organization. As if that wasn't enough, in the last 2 weeks, the convention has been now forced to make a statement about white supremacists, something they have avoided for decades. So I see this slow movement. The civilization is moving into a more tolerant, collaborative, communicative frame. But we're not going gently. And again, back to my notion that we're waiting for a generation of leaders to die. It sounds as terrible as it sounds in business. We're waiting almost for a generation to pass on to finish this transition.
So that piece you talked about fear, I think you make a really good correlation between fear and conflict, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So when you've got those two things, and you touched upon the whole notion of populism and all of that. So how do then leaders really deal with this idea of fear? Is it the same approach that you talked about in terms of conflict, or is it sort of work in parallel?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I mean, again, one of the best ways you can possibly be vulnerable, and especially when you have some street cred as a leader, is to say, this thing makes me uncomfortable. I don't know yet what I think about this, or this makes me damn uncomfortable, and I prefer not to think about it, but I'm going to put this out there, and we're going to have a conversation about it. It's hard not to respect that. It's very difficult not to respect that, I would say. And again, you've opened the door for a dialogue and some conversation. There's a self-preservation thing, I think, for a lot of us, that if we drop our shields, it's going to make us look weak. And weak is a big thing in business. Yes, we must appear strong, we must appear decisive, but that model's changing, I would argue.
But there is something to that, like, how do we address that? Like, to Azam's point, this notion of populism, and again, I don't want to get too political, but I think one of the things, like a leader like Trump, he detests coming off as looking weak. Like,
Absolutely.
you saw the way that he sort of managed his COVID diagnosis, and it was like at no point in time did he want to seem that he was either vulnerable or not in control. So how do we shift that mindset, especially when it comes to leadership?
Well, again, I don't know that we have much choice. I'm not sure that we even have to try. FDR back in the 30s and 40s could essentially hide the fact he was in a wheelchair. It was an open secret. You read that, read history of the time. The country knew that he had polio, but they didn't know it. They didn't get it, right? He was always standing and looked strong, etc. You can't keep that a secret. Franklin Roosevelt in 2020 could never hide the fact that he was crippled and couldn't walk. Yes, that would be an impossibility. You can't hide the fact these days that you're frightened or unable to manage something over the long term. This COVID thing with Trump is fascinating as an example. In the age of Twitter, Trump could say people that get COVID are weak. It was a thoughtless statement as a leader. It was a populist kind of statement. Then he gets COVID. What's he supposed to do with that? So he can say whatever he wants. He's caught out in his own contradictions. One of the things about being a leader in this age is we're watching you. We see you in ways leaderships in previous generations were never scrutinized. Yes? We're watching all kinds of things you're doing. It's time to embrace that and accept that scrutiny, because you're going to be in the spotlight whether you want to be or not.
So listening to this, I almost feel like we should have a separate episode on conflict resolution.
Absolutely.
But in the interest of time, just to bring it back, our theme being the future of our topics, right? So in this case, leadership. And this may be a silly question, but I have a two-part question for you. So one, how do you think leadership, how have you seen leadership evolve during the pandemic, and how do you see it should? And the second part being knowing that part of, unable to break the glass ceiling, as you said, is mostly white males. You talk about they relate to each other better, right? So a lot of it has to do with networking and stuff like that. Do you think going more virtual kind of helps more people break through that glass ceiling if you're not in that networking space as much as you used to?
I don't know that I can answer your second part. I don't know that we know yet. It's an interesting question, and I don't pretend to have an answer for it. My suspicion is that virtual won't make much difference as far as the glass ceiling is concerned. You're still either you're old school or you're not. Either you're a boy and you have a hard time with women, or you don't. But I don't know. The first part, leadership during the pandemic, again, I think it speaks volumes about multiple issues, that leadership has felt much more reactive for the most part than proactive when it comes to COVID. We scared ourselves pretty good in the West. We really frightened ourselves. I think we took the best steps we could take given what we knew, and I'm talking March and April of this year. where I take exception with leadership really nationally, both at the state and federal level, at least here in the States, is we have continued to feel very reactive. One of the things, to go back to the theme of leadership in the new age, is leaders really do have to look to multiple sources and really be good vetters of data. And if they're not, they need to have people who are. They need to be able to trust their own assessment of data or trust experts that can assess data for them. I'm going to call it a quick example nationally with the CDC and the president. The CDC is not an administrative or a policy-making arm of the government. The CDC is a science, technical branch that gives information to the administrators. They then make a policy decision. But our president was not willing to make policy decisions. He avoided them about COVID for a long time. So the CDC was forced into making policy statements that they shouldn't be making. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Statements about masks and social distancing and stuff. And the problem was they were talking as scientists. They weren't vetting the information for an audience. They were simply pouring unfiltered scientific data. I would argue that what the pandemic has really forced into awareness is that there is such a thing as policy. There is such a thing as leadership. We have been waiting for people to lead through the pandemic. And a great deal of the continuing fear has been a leadership vacuum. And again, I want to go back to Andrew Cuomo. I think he did a magnificent job saying, we don't know what we don't know. So we're going to do this week, and we may try something else next week. He demonstrated the virtues of a very modern or even postmodern leader by admitting his own inexpertise, by looking to his advisors, but then making a decision. That's a long answer. Maybe
No, that makes a lot of sense. No,
go ahead.
Thank you for that. It makes a lot of sense, because even if you look at countries that have relatively managed well, I think hearing directly from the scientists has been a bit of a contradiction for people, and I think not having that policy coming in has impacted. So to give her credit, so at least here in Canada, the first phase at least, both the federal and provincial government here in Ontario coordinated pretty well, I would say, despite being on different ends of the political spectrum. But
nice.
you know, we still heard a lot of stuff about masks don't work and masks, don't wear too. Even if you think about from a common person standpoint, this going back and forth thing is not very helpful. And now everyone's mandated to wear masks. It's just not a very helpful conversation, and it doesn't inspire confidence, right?
No, and that's such a perfect word. Thank you. That's what I was trying to get to earlier. Leadership will always be about inspiring confidence. Here's a constant that will not change. We want our leaders to inspire confidence. Old school, new school, populist, non-populist, we're looking for our leaders to lead, and one of the key components, maybe the key component, is a sense of confidence. And to your point about masks and data, there is so much misinformation or partial information or outdated information. This is why you have policy leaders. This is why you have leaders to cut through it and say, this is what we know now. And so, yeah, I have nothing else to say about that, except that confidence may be the central theme of this entire discussion.
So maybe just to wrap everything up, what would you say, because we touched upon a lot of different interesting points, what would you then say in terms of the future state of leadership you were able to distill it into 3 major attributes that you would say, what does the future state of an effective leader would look like?
Wow, three points.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to use perfect words, but there's a dialogue, collaborative piece that's essential to the modern or the postmodern leader. There is a willingness to have the hard conversations, address what scares us, have the difficult conversation. And there's the awareness that we're looking to you to lead. We want confidence to come from you. We need to see you as confident, not perfect, not without question, not flawless, but a confident, willing to lead leader. If I had to boil it down to 3 things, that's what I'd say.
Right. Well, Erik, thank you so very much. That was an interesting conversation. I always love to talk to you about these types of topics. And yeah, thanks. I don't know, Azam, if you have anything else you wanted to add? Or?
Just one last question. We always ask for levity. So is there one book that you would recommend our, listeners, I would say audience now, because I mean, people can watch us on YouTube. So one book, one TV show, and a movie. And I think I'm just going to add one more this season is, anything new that you have learned about yourself during this pandemic?
All right, so book, I would really push on this audience, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And then once you have that, give me a call so I can teach you how to fight.
Sounds good.
That sounds good.
You said book, TV show?
Yes, and a movie.
The West Wing. I would push The West Wing on this audience. It's seeing a resurgence in popular understanding. I'm not sure that there are many better examples anywhere on TV for leadership and the dilemmas of leadership.
Yeah.
Movie? That's a tough one. I don't know that I have a movie I could recommend off the top of my head. What have I learned from the pandemic? I think I've already told you guys. I think I have learned how important it is for leaders to be willing to take risks and lead. It's been very tempting during the pandemic to make the safe or reactive decision. I don't disparage the people that have done that. But what we need are leaders that are willing to take thoughtful risks based on the best information they've got and not wait, not to be at the back of the herd, but to be at the front of the herd. And I'm, without meaning to throw too many stones, I think that the planet is lacking that kind of leadership right now.
Awesome. No, thank you so much, Eric.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much,
Fascinating
Eric.
conversation.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Have a good
it.
day.
Hope to have you back soon sometime.
I would love to.
Yeah. Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye. We hope you enjoyed our episode. Your feedback is always appreciated. You can email us at futureof19@gmail.com. You can also visit our website at www.ftrof.com, as well as follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at futureof19. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Future Of. Please leave us your comments about what you liked, what you didn't, and what would you like to focus on for future episodes. We'd love to hear from you. And lastly, if you are enjoying our episodes, if you enjoyed Season 1, looking forward to Season 2, please consider supporting us at Patreon at www.patreon.com/futureof19. Thank you very much for your support and have yourself a wonderful day.